Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. My guest this week is Dr. Assal Rad. Dr. Rad graduated with a PhD in Middle Eastern History from the University of California, Irvine in 2018. Her PhD research focused on modern Iran with an emphasis on national identity formation and identity in post-revolutionary Iran. Assal works with the policy team of the National Iranian American Council as a research fellow on Iran policy issues and U.S. Iran relations. I spoke to Dr. Rad on Monday via Skype. Here in the United States, we get this rather one-sided view of post-revolutionary Iran. We hear about the human rights violations. We hear the chants, death to America and death to Israel. I know that our government is trying to overthrow the government in Iran, but so far they're not having much luck. So maybe you can tell us how the government of Iran is doing and how the people relate to it.
Well, I think, there's a history of sort of enmity, obviously, between the United States and Iran over the last 4 years after the revolution in 1979. And for the United States, I think that history begins with 1979 and with the hostage crisis, when in November, Iranian students took the U.S. embassy. And there's a clear reason why there would be some sort of, animosity on the U.S. side looking at that. But of course, from the Iranian perspective, the history is longer. It goes back at the very least until 1953, which is when there's a coup d'etat between the United States and the UK to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh and have the Shah reinstated into power. And of course, his rule after that was a despotic dictatorship. And so that memory is associated with the United States. And actually, up until that point, the feeling of Iranians towards the United States was very positive. Their sort of negative anti-imperial sentiments came more towards the British than any other country, and somewhat against the Russians as well, because of this, again, even further back history of this sort of great game between Britain and Russia in terms of Iran. So there's a history that we're often missing when we think about not just the Iranian psyche, but I think the Middle East more broadly. Mm-hmm. We have to consider the history of colonialism. We have to consider the history of imperialism in understanding the psyche of the Middle East. And in the case of Iran, of course, where the United States is concerned, it does really, a lot of it does stem from 1953. Because of the coup in 1953, what the concern was in 1979 was that there would be another coup. And of course, how that coup occurred was through the U.S. embassy. That's how the United States could bring personnel and people into the country and sort of carry out the coup that they did in 1953. So when they take the embassy in 1979, that's really the historical mind frame that brought that event sort of to fruition. And this is what's, again, it's always missing in the dialogue that we hear in the United States, because it's very one-sided. It's simply, they did something bad and they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. And so that's the dichotomy that we consider this relationship in. Mm-hmm. And what I would argue is we need to, on both sides, need to sort of move past, because to be fair, the Iranian side does the same thing, right? The Iranian side tries to make the argument in reverse. The United States is an evil empire. Their hands are in everything that happens in the world. And so they reverse it. They think they're the good guys fighting, sort of rebelling against the biggest powers in the world, rebelling against imperialism, and the United States is the bad actor. Both sides lack nuance in trying to understand, how can we sort of rectify this relationship and have a real honest conversation that's based on a clearer reading of the history, where, both sides have done things wrong, both sides have made mistakes, and both sides typically are acting in their own interests. And so if we can understand that, then I think moving forward, there's a better way of finding a resolution to at least our current situation.
Mm-hmm. Raise a couple of questions. One, you talked about the nations acting in their interests, and I can certainly understand what the Iranian interest would be, but what is the U.S. interest that is driving our government to want to overthrow the government of Iran?
So, on that point, I would actually say that it's not really within our interest. So, this is a sort of unique situation in which we are not working within our own interest, but in the interests of our allies, allied parties in the Middle East. So, for instance, the government of Israel has long also wanted sort of regime change in Iran, and there's an enmity that goes back and forth with those states as well. And so, what the Obama administration understood is that for the United States, there really is no interest in trying to overthrow the government in Iran because what precedent has shown historically in the region is that us getting into another conflict is just a drain on our resources. We are no better off in the United States because of our invasion of Iraq. We are no really better off because of our invasion in Afghanistan. Our role in other countries in the region have not in any way helped the United States. We're not more secure. If anything, the millions of people who have been displaced in these wars, the rise of sort of terrorism, groups like ISIS, all of those things have not only made the United States less secure, but have affected global security because these problems don't stay within those borders. You know, Europe has this massive immigration crisis, and that those immigration crises come from these policies. People are fleeing war-torn countries. So I think there was an understanding in the Obama administration that it would actually be to the advantage of the United States to sort of have a detente with Iran, and in ensuring that Iran could not get a nuclear weapon, to come to an agreement, which is what the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was the result of. It was years of negotiations, seeing that what was in the interest of the United States was Iran not having a nuclear weapon. And what this administration has done is sort of reverse all of those steps, and we really aren't working in our own interest. You know, President Trump ran on a platform that was anti-war, and for good reason. The majority of Americans do not want war. They favor diplomacy as a way of resolving issues because we don't want our troops dying needlessly. We don't want our resources being used, especially abroad when we have so many of our own domestic issues here at home. So this is a little bit different than how this question was set up, but I would say in this particular case, I would not argue that the U.S. is working in its own interest.
I would certainly agree with you on that point. You've been in Iran quite a bit, as I understand, recently because of the research you were doing for your PhD. Can you tell us how the people of Iran view their own government, and do they support the current government in Iran, or is there a lot of dissent under the surface?
So I conducted research in Iran from 2004 basically to 2015, and I traveled there regularly every year for months at a time. I maintain ties with people who are there. I have friends and family there, and then obviously I had interlocutors who I would use in terms of my research, and so I've maintained quite a few ties as well to still try and get information from inside the country. And I mean, saying that there is dissent is an understatement. There is a massive amount of dissent in the Iranian population vis-a-vis its government. What has to be understood in the Iranian case as well is the government's makeup is a little bit more complex because there's one body of the government that's democratically elected, albeit even that notion of it being democratically elected, it's filtered quite a bit by the non-elected body, which is the supreme leadership. So Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of the country, is not an elected official. The bodies that he has the power to appoint are based, again, not on elections. And so there are different strands of thought within Iran where there are people who dissent towards the entire thing. There are people who are okay with the elected body of the government, but have significant issues, obviously, with what is a dictatorship, right? What is something that, if not elected, that they have no power over. And to be fair, just to be accurate, there are people in the country who are also supporters of that government. So in the same sense that, for instance, in the United States, you could use the general election from 2016 to say that President Trump was not the most popular candidate. You could use his approval rating, all sorts of data that would point to the fact that there's a lot of dissent against this particular administration, but it would be misleading to say he doesn't have support in the country, because of course that's not true. He has a significant portion of support. There is a significant branch of the population that supports both the president and his ideological outlook. So that's the same with any country, and in the case of Iran. But there's a great deal of dissent because Iranians want the freedoms that they were promised in the revolution. They want just the most basic things that we sort of take for granted here in the United States, and the wanting an actual representative government, meaning it's only run by people who are elected into a position, and that position expires after a set amount of years, and they don't have that with the supreme leadership that oversees basically the larger activities of the government. But what's happened with, again, the sort of policy that the Trump administration has used, this idea of maximum pressure, leaving the JCPOA, just brutal sanctions that have hurt Iran's economy. In the context of the deal itself, what the Trump administration has done is played into the hands of the sort of least democratic, not least, I should say, non-democratic, hardline elements of the country, because they're the voices who have often been against the United States, whereas it was the more moderate voices, the elected body who is more representative of what Iranian people actually wanted, which was the nuclear deal, which is overwhelmingly popular amongst Iranians. They wanted a more open society. They wanted better relations with the West, especially with the United States. They wanted economic relief. These are the things that they wanted and hoped to gain through the deal. And once the United States left the deal, from their point of view, without provocation, right? Iran was complying by the deal when the United States chose to violate it. Iran continued to comply with the deal as the United States slapped on sanction after sanction. And so it's created a sort of rally around the flag moment for Iranians. And it's unfortunate, really, for someone from my point of view as an Iranian American, someone who's grown up, born and raised in the United States, and has always wanted to see this relationship somehow be mended, to see the worst sort of elements in that government gain any sort of legitimacy. But that legitimacy coming from the fact that now when they argue the United States is not a trusted partner, they have a very tangible and sort of obvious example to point to.
Well, you recently wrote, I think, that I'm quoting here, to say that justified opposition to the Islamic Republic is the same as the desire for foreign-led regime change is a dangerously false equivalency. So we shouldn't take it that this dissent that you talk about means that Americans would be welcomed with open arms and flowers.
No, that's certainly not. So there's two images that you see. One that comes from sort of the officials in Iran, that America is hated, and there are these ridiculous chants and all of that. That is misleading, because that's not how Iranian people feel. Iranian people do not have animosity, or have not had, I should say, animosity towards the United States. And really, they associate their plight and their hardship with the corruption of their own government. What's happened is that's been tarnished a bit, because now it's very easy for that government to blame the United States. If you can't get medicine, well, it's because of sanctions. If food prices have gone extremely high, it's because of sanctions. And on the U.S. side, the idea that because they have an issue, they take issue with their government, then they would be happy to have foreigners sort of come in and, quote, help them. That's not the prism that they see it through, right? For especially Iranians see their sort of national identity as stemming back to the Persian Empire that was 2,500 years ago. So it's a very prideful, historically rooted identity, and it was one that was, even though Iran was never formally colonized, it was still one where they saw themselves as being beholden to foreign powers, especially when they were under the Shah. And so anything where foreign sort of invasion or foreign aggression is what comes in, it sparks that sort of, that's why I said the rally around the flag, that sort of nationalism, really, that pride of resistance. And there's all sorts of components within their culture and their history that facilitates that kind of thinking. And so going into it as an aggressor, if we're the United States on our side, will not be welcome. But the nuclear deal, for instance, was welcome because it wasn't the US coming in and saying, you know, we're going to tell you what you're going to do. It was two parties that came to the table, negotiated something through a discussion, and came to a compromise. And so that was celebrated across the country. They didn't see it as a concession to another power. At least I can say the majority of Iranians didn't see it that way. The very, very right-wing hardliners, in fact, did. They argued that, you know, this is a concession to the United States, but that's not what the masses of Iranians thought. They thought, you know, no, this is how normal states act. You have dialogue with other states, even if you are not allies necessarily, but then you can come to a compromise. And so it was really a pivotal moment, I think, for Iranians in terms of understanding how their own government was going to operate and how the U.S. was operating with them.
You're listening to Dr. Assal Rad of the National Iranian American Council speaking on Wider View. Wider View is a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found on the mainstream media, and it's made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide. The podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. And now back to my conversation with Dr. Rad. One thing that I get concerned about too, and we've talked about it on this program before, there's a certain momentum that the drive for war takes, and now we have the U.S. sanctioning the supreme leader of Iran and the foreign minister seizing oil tankers in international waters, and Iran seizing a tanker of their own. Is there a path to peace, to ratcheting down these hostilities and moving towards some sort of normal relationship between the U.S. and Iran?
So there's steps to be taken, right? I think normalizing relations is sort of at the very, very end of a long road of steps that have to be taken until we can get somewhere like that. I am hopefully optimistic that is, you know, it's within our power to do so, because really all it requires is having the right people in power making the right decisions to get there. The concern with, you know, you talked about seizures of tankers, this sort of striking of drones, putting more vessels in the Persian Gulf. All of this, the worry is that there's almost a mistake, a miscalculation that gets us into a conflict, because from both sides, all of the measures are very, very calculated, because I think both sides have made it clear they do not want an actual conflict. I think both sides have an understanding of how bad the outcome can actually be. And so they've practiced some restraint, but they need much more restraint, because the situation that we've gotten in is so tense, you know, that it just requires one mistake or one thing to sort of spark the conflict. And this is true of a lot of wars that we've seen in history. I mean, World War I is, and I'm not saying that this will cause a world war, but simply as an anecdote, looking at the fact that the spark of that conflict was the assassination of one individual. And so now you get parties that sort of fall into this position where they have no choice but to get into conflict with each other. That's the concern. And as long as we are still in a position where we can backtrack. And I think, you know, even today you hear statements from the president of France, Macron, who's talking about still trying to negotiate something between the United States and Iran. You hear President Rouhani talking in front of the Iranian Majlis, saying that, you know, if he doesn't specifically name the United States, but says something to the effect of, you know, if it is to the benefit of our state, then, you know, we would talk. Of course, we would talk to somebody. You've had President Trump making the same types of comments where he's wanted to have negotiations with Iran. So I think there is a reason to be hopeful. But what's concerning is that there are parties involved who do not have the same goal. So if Iran doesn't want a war and the United States, at least in terms of President Trump himself, do not want a war, there are other people who don't mind a conflict or, in fact, will try to facilitate one. One of them being one of the president's key advisors, National Security Advisor John Bolton, right? John Bolton has talked about regime change in Iran openly. John Bolton has written about attacking Iran. So one of the issues I think that we see for our president, at least, is that he doesn't have advisors that are aligned with his vision of wanting to negotiate and wanting to, prevent an actual war from taking place.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. And Bolton has gone so far as actually to speak at the a conference of the MEK, which is a terrorist group working to overthrow the government in Iran. And I believe is associated as well with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which a quite poorly named organization.
Intentionally so, of course.
Intentionally, yes. Yes, they're really trying to overthrow at least a form of democracy. Maybe you can tell us a little bit while we're here about the National Iranian American Council that you work for and what they're all about and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, really what we're dedicated to building political power for the Iranian American community, and our key sort of initiatives or ideas are to advance peace and diplomacy, secure equitable immigration policies, and protect the civil rights of all Americans. So we're an American organization, and sometimes this actually gets confusing because people think or mistakenly believe that we're an Iranian opposition group, which we are not. We're an American organization made up of Iranian Americans like myself, who really just want to make sure that we are represented in our own government so that when our government makes decisions that affect us, such as the travel ban or Muslim ban, that Iran is not included in the list, that we have the same immigration policies that any other immigrant group coming to the United States has, that our civil rights as Iranian Americans are protected in the United States. So, for instance, right now, one of the issues that Iranians living in the United States have is bank closures. Because of the sanctions, the sanction law is just becoming so broad that a lot of banking institutions don't even want to deal with the fear of violating the sanctions. And so they're even, they ask citizenship questions of people. Are you a citizen? Can you have a bank account? And they're starting to close the bank accounts of Iranian Americans based on their nationality. So these are the things that we try to protect against. And then in terms of U.S. foreign policy, it's really advocating peace and diplomacy, because we don't see how war is ever going to be a positive answer or a solution. It really not only is it the worst human rights violation, it creates more problems than it could potentially try to solve. And so we always favor diplomacy, dialogue, and the fact that if we can talk through issues, we can always find some common ground.
Well, I hope we can in relation to Iran. Assal, is there anything else that you would like to say that maybe I haven't asked or you think is important to reiterate?
I think in reiterating, one of the things for me, and this isn't just unique to the way that we talk about Iran, although we in the United States talk about Iran quite a bit. It's really important in understanding in any conflict that we have to see the other side. If we continue to, and I've emphasized at the beginning, but I have to keep repeating it because I feel like our media especially does this all the time. If we only look at it from our own perspective, we're missing half of the story. And oftentimes we think of other actors as being irrational or having some kind of ideological motive that's quite different than ours. And that's just not the case. Iranians, like all people, like Americans, have the same sort of aspirations that we do. And so I would like to get away from the caricature that we've built of these people and sort of humanize them and realize that it's not weird for them to take issue with a country that takes such a sort of bellicose rhetoric against them. Like our president has tweeted things like, he will end Iran. That no one would take kindly to that kind of a note. We certainly wouldn't. And so we have to realize that the psychology behind others is very similar to our own. And so in the same way that we would become defensive if, for instance, if the water surrounding us was full of ships, Iranian ships, there were Iranian drones flying around our borders, there were Iranian bases in Canada and Mexico. If all of that was the case, then we would clearly feel threatened. And so if the Iranian side actually does feel threatened, then we should be able to understand it from a different point of view.
Well, I think that's very astute. I mean, I think this is one of the things that Americans, particularly elite Americans, have difficulty doing. That's putting themselves in the place of another nation and thinking about it from how people somewhere else would take it. So I do appreciate that.
I do.
So,
if you don't mind, I actually did want to add one thing.
Yes.
The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and we think of it often the way that it's talked about in the media is, this particular deal between the United States, obviously other parties to the deal, China, Germany, UK, Iran, different parties to the deal, as an international agreement that just curtailed Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon. But I really think that it's important to understand that it's not just something that can be applied to Iran. It can be used as a model for global cooperation. And the reason why that's so important is because nuclear non-proliferation is not an Iranian issue. This is a global issue. Making sure that our safety, not just as Americans, but as citizens of the world, making sure that we are safe from a nuclear war is of vital importance. And what this deal did is it only prevented Iran from getting a weapon, but the point of it is that it could be a model in understanding how we can negotiate these types of deals across the board. And it should have been a model for the entirety of the Middle East to denuclearize that zone. Right. And so I think that's something that's often missing from the conversation too, which is this is less an issue of Iran as one state that's acting in the region and more an issue of nuclear non-proliferation and why it's so important to global security.
Right. Very, very good point. Well, I'm going to have to leave it there, but I thank you very much, Assal, for your comments and your input. Very much appreciated.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again to Dr. Assal Rad of the National Iranian American Council for joining me. As always, the views expressed here on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.